Okay, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for coming. Why don't we get started? I'm sorry I'm 2 minutes late, so I will speak a little faster. We're looking at the life of Rabbi Shimon bar Yohai, a very famous 2nd century thinker, rabbi, highly influential, whose life began, or really his leadership began, in the wake of the Hadrian persecutions of the 130s, which is an extremely difficult time for Jews, and it was through leadership of people like Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai that we managed to emerge once again and establish a firm intellectual, spiritual, ultimately economic and social foundation for our civilization. So the joke goes like this. And this is one I actually heard when I was doing my doctoral research in Kiev. And at the time, it was in the late 90s, it was in the late 80s, the Soviet Union was falling apart, and it was really chaotic. There were all kinds of crazy things going on at the time. And one of the problems that they had was widespread alcoholism. People were drinking whiskey and vodka, and especially this terrible moonshine they called samahon, which means self-cooking or cooked at home. And it was dangerous. It was potentially poisonous. People would die of wood alcohol poisoning if they didn't know how to make this drink properly. So Gorbachev at the time launched a massive anti-alcohol campaign that was, across the entire Soviet Union, and it was trying to get people to diminish their intake of spirits. That part is true. Now the joke goes like this. Gorbachev takes a junket of journalists out to Siberia to promote his anti-alcoholism campaign. And they fly in an Aeroflot jet all the way out to Novosibirsk somewhere, and they land and they go to a huge factory, and all the journalists are following the president around, and he goes into the factory floor, he goes into the conveyor belts there, and he walks up to a typical Soviet citizen. He says to him, "Ivan, do you think a person could have 3 drinks of whiskey and go to work in the morning?" And Ivan says, "No, Mr. President. Yes, I think he could." And he says to him, "Ivan, do you think a person could have 10 shots of vodka and go to work in the morning?" He says, "No, Mikhail Sergeyevich. Yes, I think it's possible." And then he says to him, "Ivan, do you think a person could drink 3/4 of a bottle of samahon and still go to work in the morning?" He says, "You see, I'm working." So, to a certain degree, that's what this story is about too, that the Jews go through so much persecution century after century, and yet nevertheless, you see we're working, you see we're still continuing on, and that's going to be the topic for today. If you know one story about Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai, it is most likely this story from the Talmud. It's in Tractate Shabbat, page 33. We're going to actually refer to it in a couple of occasions, but I'll just choose the middle part of the story right here. Basically, what happens is, recall where we are in terms of history, right? We spoke about it for the last 2 weeks. The Bar Kokhba revolt, approximately 132, very, very successful in the initial period. Perhaps 3 years, Jerusalem is liberated from the Romans. They're minting their own coins. They're trying to, revive Jewish life and so on. But the Romans bring in battalions from all over, including as far away as England, and they crush the rebellion. And then they follow it up with some horrific persecutions that we will return to a little later, because Rabbi Akiva, Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai's teacher, was caught up in those terrible days. And but the context of this particular passage is that after the revolution, which is not mentioned explicitly here, but it's clear that's what's going on, Rabbi Shimon is a warrant is put out for his arrest and for his execution. And so he tries to hide at first with his son Elazar, who is also in trouble. He tries to hide in the Beit Midrash, in the study hall, and his wife is bringing him food every day. But he says, you know what, this is too dangerous for her. If they question her, then perhaps, they'll torture her, God forbid. So he says to his son, we have to go off and we have to hide in a cave. So let me find this one passage here. Okay. Azal Tashuba Marasa. They went and they hid in a cave. You can imagine something like the caves we looked at in the last 2 weeks, the cave of Babatha, for example. Israchesh Nisa Ibralahu Charuva Ve'ena Demaya. a miracle occurred, and a carob tree grew up just outside the opening of the cave, and a well of water opened up. And so they would use this for their sustenance. They would go into the cave, and because they were there for an indefinite period of time with only one change of clothes, they would take off all of their clothes and bury themselves in sand all day, and they would study Torah. It's a pretty bizarre story. Here he is with his son. He's in this cave, buried up, I imagine, to their necks in sand. Thank you, Mr. Rodriguez. Buried up to their necks in sand, studying Torah. And when they had to pray, the 3 times daily prayers, they would come out, they would put on their clothes, they would daven, and then maybe they'd have a snack of a carob or two, and then back into the sand. And they did this because they didn't want their clothes to wear out. They stayed in that cave for 12 years, learning Torah, just the two of them the whole time. Finally, Eliyahu Hanavi, Elijah the prophet, who in Jewish tradition is always kind of like showing up at key events and times, the Seder table, things like that, where he partakes of milk and cookies. No, wait, that's somebody else. He usually has a glass of wine. And that was a joke for some of you out in Latvia there. So Eliyahu comes, and he said, "Come up vapiska demara." So he stood at the opening of the cave. Amar man lude lavar Yohai demis kesar batal gezerase. Who will tell the son of Yohai, that's our protagonist, that the Caesar has died and the decree is over? So we're assuming sometime 12 years perhaps after the death of Hadrian, something like that, or 12 years after the decrees. It's not entirely clear what the chronology is. But now listen to what happens afterwards. Nafku, so they came out. After 12 years living in the cave studying Torah, they come out. Chazu inshe de karabe vezare. They saw Jews farming. Saw people out there going about their farming business. Amar, so Rabbi Shimon ben Yohai says, Manichin chaye olam v'oschin b'chaye shah. They abandon the eternal life and they engage in temporal life. As a criticism, what does he mean by that? They should be studying Torah full time, like us in a cave. Don't worry, we'll get a miracle, we'll get a carob tree, things like that. So, and I'm emphasizing this because it's an element of Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai's persona that penetrates his life and also really penetrates, in my humble opinion, a certain sort of trend, a sort of strata in Jewish society, even to the present day. We'll see it even in contemporary Israel, maybe suburbs of Jerusalem, places like Lakewood and Brooklyn. And it says here, so what happens is, it's even worse, Kol makam shenosin einehen, any place they cast their eyes, meaning Rabbi Elazar, when Shimon would look at something, miyad nisraf, immediately whatever they looked at would be burned up. Right? Meaning you can take it on a literal level, which the Talmud is saying that their holiness from studying the Torah had given them such superpowers that when they looked askance at a field of wheat or something like that, then the wheat would go up in flames. So guess what happened at that point? Yatzta basko va'amra. So a divine voice rang out and said lahem to them, Lahachari v'olamei yatzasam. What are you guys doing? Are you trying to destroy my world? It doesn't say, what are you guys doing? It says, are you trying to destroy my world? Meaning, this is not what I planned here. I don't want you to come out of the cave and start burning everybody's fields up. Chazru l'maraschem, back into the cave with you guys. And so the two of them, Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai and his son, get thrown back into the cave. So they get stuck back in there for another 12 years. But they stop that. They say, Amar Mishpat Rishoim Beganim Yud Beis Chodesh. Even the most wicked people sent to hell are only there for 12 months. So we really can't stay here for 12 years. So then God, as it were, compromised, Baskal for Amra, Yasa Baskal Basra, Tsumi Raskam. So okay, you can go out. And when they come out, then they have a slightly different attitude. And we'll return to this story later, both in its prelude and in its epilogue. The point of this story, though, is that you see Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai engaged in incredibly deep contemplative prayer and study, which will, lend to his reputation as the premier Kabbalist, at least since the days of Moses in traditional thought. He is without doubt the greatest of the mystics. And you also see his, his initial intolerance of anything but that pure Torah ideology, which then, of course, he himself has to go through a transformation to say, all right, there is a place for these other things in life. We haven't actually got to that denouement yet, but we shall shortly. But that's perhaps the most famous story about Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai. So let's look a little bit more at his life. As I mentioned earlier, it's best to understand his life within the context, historically at any rate, of the Hadrianic persecutions. Emperor Hadrian shown here to the left. And we won't go over the reasons for this again because we've discussed it in previous classes, but it was a period of tremendous persecution for Jews and especially for Jewish leadership. You'll recall that Bar Kokhba was well supported by the Pharisaic leadership, by the Perushim, the rabbinic leaders of the time, most notably by Akiva ben Yosef, the greatest of them, who according to the Talmud had 24,000 students, who all died mysteriously in this period during the Hadrianic persecutions. Some historians would say they were killed by the Romans. The Talmud itself gives a few other reasons, including a plague and so on. But at any rate, Rabbi Akiva was spared temporarily in order to endure a show trial and a horrific punishment in order to deter other would-be Jewish rebels. The story goes that while Akiva was jailed, his student, Rabbi Shimon, came to him to the jail and wanted to learn more Torah from him. And Akiva said to him, Shimon, what do you want from me? Do you see how much trouble I am in for studying Torah? Don't you know that's what's going to happen to me is that, I'm going to be killed probably on the morrow? Why are you here trying to study Torah from me? Shimon says, you have to teach me Torah. It's an incredibly important thing, and I won't let you go unless you teach me. And Akiva responds, very beautiful passage. He says, if you want to hang yourself, you should find a taller tree. Meaning, in his humility, if you really want to be in trouble for this, find someone who's a greater rabbi than I. Shimon, in his insistence, says, if you don't allow me to hear your words of Torah, I will go tell my father Yohai about this, and you will get even in worse trouble. So you see, just by one little passage, there are other passages elsewhere that corroborate this. Shimon and his father Yohai had something of a generational gap, that Yochai was more in favor of the traditional Pharisaic ideal of accommodation with the Romans, or at least that strategic or tactical retreat to say, look, you leave us alone, we'll leave you alone, whereas Akiva was more of a rebel, and Shimon sided with the rebels. So Shimon was threatening to go to Yochai and inform on Akiva, which was more of a simply an empty threat than anything else, because nothing worse could happen to Akiva at this point. Finally, Akiva says to him a beautiful passage which doesn't translate very well into English, but I'll try anyways. He says, more than the calf wishes to suckle, the mother wishes to nurse. Meaning that the baby cow wants the milk, but more importantly and more intensely, the mother wants to give the milk. In other words, Shimon, you want to learn Torah. You have no idea how much I want to teach you Torah, but still I can't because it's just going to get you in worse trouble. Akiva, of course, dies a horrible death. The next day, his flesh is raked with irons until he expires. It's recorded, and we read it every year in the Eila Ezkara section of the Machzor during Yom Kippur, where we look at the 10 martyrs of the state, who are all rabbis who died during these Hadrianic persecutions. And Akiva was the greatest among them. You'll recall perhaps the story where he pronounced the Shema at the moment of his expiration, and his students, got a sense of his greatness. But this is kind of like the intellectual background that Shimon bar Yochai comes from. The Talmud cites Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai with incredible frequency, and his teachings, which are sometimes recorded simply as Rabbi Shimon, sometimes with the acronym Rashbi for Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai, are considered extremely authoritative because they represent the tradition of Akiva ben Yosef. And so he's considered one of the greatest rabbis because he embodies the teachings of Akiva. Oh, you're just... Yes, please.
So he did study with Rabbi Akiva, or he didn't?
No, he absolutely did. This was at the end of his life. He was saying, please, one more teaching, please one more. He was the Talmud Muvhak of Rabbi Akiva, one of the 5 that the Talmud says survived the Hadrianic persecutions. So this, out of 24,000 students, again, that's a number the Talmud uses. It's hard to understand if that's meant literally or if that's meant metaphorically, but he had a massive number of students, but only 5 named students survived. Rabbi Shimon was considered the greatest among them. Okay, so now he had, how did he get in trouble in the beginning? This is something that is illustrative of his ideology as well, and his persona. I don't like to say personality, because how can you say personality about such giants? We only have a tiny grasp of what they must have been like. But you can see in the literary evidence what exactly he would have felt about some of these larger things. So this is probably something that occurred, in the context of the Bar Kokhba revolution, perhaps shortly thereafter, but I'll just read to you what it says. So 3 rabbis are sitting and talking. They are Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Yossi, and Rabbi Shimon. So these 3 rabbis are sitting and talking. But Yasiv Yehuda ben Gerim Gabehu. And there was another rabbi there whose name was, no, he doesn't say rabbi. There was another person there whose name was Yehuda ben Gerim. Pasach Rabbi Yehuda v'omer. So Rabbi Yehuda says, Kama na'im ma'asehen shel umazo. How wonderful are the achievements, are the acts of this people. Rashi explains, umazo, this people means the Romans. We love those Romans. They are great. Why? Tiknu shvakim, they set up malls, like marketplaces. Tiknu gesharim, they built bridges. Tiknu merchatzaos, they built bathhouses. I mean, they were hugely invested in public works, which is true, by the way. The Romans were incredible builders. You see here a Roman aqueduct. I mean, phenomenal, large public achievements. The road system in Europe is heavily dependent on the original Roman architecture, and of course water transport, sewage, all of these big public works projects were typical of the Romans. So that was Rabbi Yehuda's opinion. I like those Romans because I like my aqueducts. Now, Rabbi Yossi Shasak. Rabbi Yossi decided to say nothing. Again, remember, the Jews are Gesundheit, deep in fighting with the Romans at this point. Rabbi Shimon, however, that's our protagonist, Nana Rabbi Shimon for Amar, he said, Kol ma shetiknu lo tiknu el letzorech atzman. Everything they built was entirely selfish. They built it all for themselves. How so? Tiknu shvakim lahoshi behen zonos. They built marketplaces in order that they could have houses of ill repute, in order that they could have places where they could find entertainment. Merchatzaos la'aden mehan. They built bathhouses not to cleanse themselves, but just to chill, to hang out, like to go to the Schwitz. Gesharim lito mehem machas. They built bridges so they could collect tolls. I mean, all of this stuff was purely self-motivated. So what ended up happening? You have 3 rabbis, right? The first one said, I love these Romans. The second one said nothing. Rabbi Shimon said, no, this is all purely self-interest. Halach Yehuda ben Gerim. So Yehuda ben Gerim went, v'sipur divreim, and he told people what he heard. Rashi says it's not like he was doing anything wicked. He was telling his father, he was telling his students, he was just saying, oh, I heard these 3 rabbis talking. But of course, that was a dangerous thing to do. Why? V'nishmu l'malchus, because the story became known to the Romans. So then what the Romans did is, Yehuda, who praised them, they gave him a big promotion. The Yossi, who said nothing, they exiled him. And Rabbi Shimon, they put an APB out for him. And that's why he had to go into the cave, because he spoke his mind about the Romans, and he was rather critical. Now, that's one of the more difficult aspects of Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai's teachings is quite often, I don't say quite often, but often enough, there are some really strong anti-Gentile statements in his teachings. I'm not going to quote most of them. All you have to do is wander around YouTube and you will find all these passages, usually taken out of context, but he has some strong things to say which are highly ethnocentric in nature. To quote one of the passages that is perhaps the least offensive because it's placed within the sort of larger mythic terms of the Bible, he says, Halacha leolam, it is an eternal law, Esav son Yaakov. Esau hates Jacob. Meaning, this is just an essential condition of the non-Jewish world, that Jacob will be hated. Just like Esau hated his brother Jacob, so too will Jews always be hated by the outside world. Again, these are difficult passages to understand on a philosophical level. I'm not going to entertain them because I'm not a rabbi. I'm just a professor of history. But you can certainly, when you put it within the historical context, understand the kind of suffering that Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai personally went through, what he saw his teacher go through, and the kind of massacres that were part of the aftermath of the Bar Kokhba revolution. You can certainly understand why he would have some strong feelings about the Romans and about non-Jewish society at the same time. So these things all come out of his relationship with the larger world. But that's subsumed within a far more central aspect of his personality, which is this dedication to Torah study. Let me provide for you another quote. This is from Pirkei Avot, and I actually had Mr. Rodriguez, who is multi-talented. Mr. Rodriguez, for those of you who are in Latvia watching right now, he's behind the camera there. And he's a chaplain in the U.S. military, candidate chaplain in the U.S. military, just completing his master's degree in religious studies, and a fiercely knowledgeable individual. So I asked him, I said, find this quote for me, please. And here it says, Rabbi Yaakov says, now I'm pretty sure this is Rabbi Shimon in other readings. Maybe that's why I couldn't find it. But I'll read it to you, and I'll have to look up exactly what's going on. So he found it even when I had remembered it mistakenly. Hamahalech b'derech v'shoneh u'maspik mishnah sova omer. So someone's walking down the road, and he's reviewing his learning, and he interrupts his learning and says, Ma na'eh ilan zeh. What a beautiful tree. Uma na'eh nir zeh. How beautiful is this field? Maila alav hakasav kilu mischayev benafsho. The Torah considers as if he should give up his life. So, meaning it's a very strong passage here in a central text, Pirkei Avot, and the basic concept of it is that Torah study is so incredibly important that really you should not be distracted from that study by anything else in the world. It's written in hyperbolic language. How do we understand that on a real level? You have to go speak to a religious expert. I'm not one of those. But nevertheless, it gives you a sense of the monofocus that is characteristic of Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai and that sort of strata in Jewish thought. Okay, the passage that Judith is referring to is when there are all these rabbis in Bnei Brak, which, by the way, was the town where Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai studied with Rabbi Akiva in Bnei Brak. In the modern day, Bnei Brak is there today, and they're discussing the exodus from Egypt, and they just keep talking and talking and talking. You know how rabbis are, until finally their students come and they say, "Rabbis, you got to stop talking because the dawn is breaking and it's time to say the morning prayers." So Judith's observation is that there is this kind of tropism where when you get involved in Torah, you just want to immerse yourself in it completely. It's overwhelming, takes over everything, even the natural body functions of sleep. I mean, the rabbi and his son were sleeping in a cave in sand up to their necks, and yet the real world intrudes and says, you got to go out, you have to pray the afternoon prayers and so on. And in fact, we see when he comes out of the cave, we'll see at the end of the lecture, that he also has to come to terms with the reality of quotidian life.
I have one more observation.
Excellent.
It's very realistic, but are we to understand that in this story, they did it all from memory because it would have been difficult to turn the pages?
I think it would have been difficult to learn Tabor's pages, but yeah, I think we are to understand they did most of it from memory. And there's no question that, I mean, what you're asking is really a fantastic discussion that we could open up about the modalities of learning. To quote a non-Jewish source, for example, in one of the Platonic dialogues, can't remember who says it, but someone says to Socrates, "Isn't it great that we invented writing? It's such a memory aid." And Socrates says, "You've got it all wrong. Writing has destroyed memory, because once you know you can write it down, then you rely on the paper and you rely on the text. You don't have memory anymore. Before writing, that's when everything is, stored in the mind." And the oral Torah, which is primarily, in this case, we're talking about Mishnah and later Talmud, the vast majority of it was memorized. It was just, and you had people who were professional memorizers who would, called the Tanaim, who would come out and would actually repeat massive sections of text. And scholars who might not be able to memorize themselves would hire them and would keep them around and say, what did Rabbi Elazar say about that certain kind of loaf of bread? And these memorizers would cough it up like Wikipedia. So they definitely, the idea of them learning in the cave by memory was not at all weird. In fact, I'm going to tell you one other story. Well, I have a lot of stories that illustrate this, but just one, and it gives you a sense of how we've changed even in a few short generations. One of my study partners when I lived in Toronto told me that his father in Europe, and he was not a rabbi, not an extremely learned person, just a regular kind of Jew, they used to like to travel at the end of the Sabbath to a neighboring town, but it was outside of the Sabbath boundary. You're only allowed to travel a certain distance out of town by foot on the Sabbath. So what they would do, and you couldn't carry anything because they did not have an eruv around that area. So my study partner told me that his father remembers as a young man walking with his friends out to that Sabbath boundary on a Saturday afternoon and waiting for the Sabbath to end because they couldn't walk further, and they weren't allowed to carry any books with them, so they would repeat an entire tractate of Talmud. They would review it mentally. And we're talking now about something that takes, 250 pages to translate into English. And with a few young men, they're able to recreate the entire Talmud. And that's only, let's say, in the first couple decades of the 20th century. So you can imagine how our culture today, with our smartphones that have the entire Talmud on there in a second, how our memory is really deteriorated. Really interesting digression. Let's get back to the text, though. Okay. Despite his antipathy to Rome, as we discussed earlier, he became recognized among the remnants of the Jews living in Israel as a leadership figure, and he was actually appointed by a community to specifically go to Rome at one point and to plead the case of the Jews and to try and avert any further decrees being passed against them. We don't know a lot about the details of that message to Rome, but it seems to be widely supported throughout the text. What is kind of fascinating about that particular trip to Rome is that he is associated with perhaps the first miracle in his life, and I'm omitting the vast majority of them, but the legends that are associated with this particular trip are fascinating. Again, given the way rabbinic literature is structured, sometimes it's difficult to understand which legends are justly attributed to Shimon bar Yochai and which legends may have been written about another rabbi and pasted on to Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai, but nevertheless the fact that there are such legends circulating about him gives you a sense of how he was regarded. Specifically, the story was that the Jews had no idea how they were going to get the emperor of Rome to rescind a particular decree. So Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai employed a type of a demon, a shade, which then went and possessed the daughter of the emperor. Like a dibuk kind of thing, where this demon somehow made her mentally ill, and they were very worried about it. They didn't know what to do. So Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai shows up, and as the legend goes, he offers to heal the young woman, and of course he performs an exorcism which then removes the demon. The emperor is so grateful, he says, you can have anything in my storehouse of treasure. And so Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai goes and he finds that particular decree that is, impending some doom for the Jewish people. He says, this is what I'd like to take, and the emperor says, that's easy, and so the Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai takes it and rips it up. Again, this particular legend may not be justly associated with Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai, but it points to a much larger trend in his life, and that is his miracle working. We'll return to that in a moment. There's also a lot of beautiful stories about Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai. I don't want you to leave with this impression that he was like incredibly intolerant and completely focused on Torah study, disdainful of others and so on, because that's not an accurate portrayal. Another story associated with him is there was a couple that had difficulty bearing children, and after 10 years of attempting to have children, they decided that they would get a divorce. There's an interesting body of Jewish law discussing this. So they went to Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai and they said, it's just not working, and so we want to have a divorce, and we'd like you to, write the get and make sure that everything's done appropriately. And Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai apparently could see that they actually cared for each other very much, and he wanted to find some other way for them to achieve their objectives. So he said, well, listen, how about this? When you got married, you made a big party, so when you get divorced, you should also make a big party. You should also have a celebration of your life together and of now you're going separate ways. So they had a big party and they invited all their friends and it was a wonderful time. And that night, they were feeling so good about each other, and lo and behold, she became pregnant, and so they decided not to get divorced after all. It's a beautiful story. Maybe it should be a strategy for other couples who unfortunately are not able to have children, but you get a sense of Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai's sensitivity, and his association with miracles certainly didn't hurt in that case either. Now, some of the miracles are really quite amazing and fantastic, even beside the demons. There's a whole discussion of his cleansing of the city of Tiberias, in which the city was apparently filled with unmarked graves, which represent a problem particularly for Jews who are Kohanim. If a Jew is a Kohen, part of the priestly tribe, he's not allowed to be in the vicinity of a graveyard. He can't walk over graves and things like that. Unmarked graves are particularly difficult for Kohanim. So Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai, as the legend goes, he elevated all of the graves and removed all of those bodies. He identified them from, underneath driveways and things like that, and had the bodies moved and purified the entire town so that people could live there. There's one version of that story that actually says all those who are buried arise, and all those who are arisen should be entombed. And the guy who informed on him back in the story I told you earlier, he ended up dying and having to be buried in Tiberia in a proper cemetery. But the idea of his association with miracles is very profound throughout the text. Now we have to get to one of the more complex and difficult aspects of his life, and that is his association with this book, the Zohar. And the truth be told, many lectures that you might find on the internet about Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai will probably start with this point, identifying Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai as the author of the Zohar. This is a very problematic statement that already came into question even in the Middle Ages. So let me just kind of outline a little bit of the debate. And the truth is we're going to omit most of the discussion because it properly belongs in the 13th century, not in the 2nd century. Basically, what is the Zohar? It is a huge Aramaic language commentary on the Torah, which is deeply Kabbalistic in nature. It is one of the most central texts of Jewish mysticism, a massive, rambling text, very difficult to understand, clearly made up of many, many different levels and most likely authors who are contributing to this massive work that has been extensively studied, particularly by Gershom Scholem in the 20th century, Moshe Idel after him, breaking it down into its constituent parts. It has been always associated with Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai since it was first released to the public world in the late 13th century by a rabbi named Moshe de Leon. He claimed that he discovered this book, and it had been hidden for so many centuries, studied privately by Kabbalists, handing it down from one Kabbalist to a student, that student later to his student, and so on, until finally in the 13th century, because of material circumstances, it had to be made public, and the Zohar was released to the larger world. And it became an amazingly popular work, the subject of many learned commentaries, and earned a place of tremendous authority within the mystical tradition. The problem is there's a lot of internal literary evidence to indicate that Moshe de Leon did not discover the Zohar. He may have actually authored it, or he may have edited it, meaning it may be, and a lot of evidence points to this, it may be a creation of 13th century Kabbalah, not 2nd century Kabbalah. And the attribution to Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai is the kind of thing that, at least in the classical world, was very commonly done. People would write books, and then they would put someone else's name on it. Unlike, as I like to say today, where people take other people's books and put their own name on it, right? It's the opposite of what we like to do today. But at any rate, adding Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai's name to the author line was a way of promoting this particular work. And the evidence is really quite... it's not inconsiderable. It has to be looked at. Like as Rabbi Joseph Telushkin put it in one of his books, if you look at, for example, the language that's used in the Zohar, there are words that show up there that are totally inappropriate for 2nd century work. He says it's like reading an ancient work and suddenly finding the word Oldsmobile show up in the middle of it. Like, the word Oldsmobile does not belong in the 2nd century. It doesn't make sense otherwise. And they're like passages which are clearly echoing things which were written 1,000 years later that are repeated in the Zohar, and a lot of like the archaeology of the background of the Zohar really belongs to a later date. Now, that's not at all to diminish the tremendous spiritual power of the Zohar. And by the way, there are many proponents who expend tremendous energy defending the traditional view of the Zohar as being authored by Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. This is not a closed debate, although the bulk of the scholarly world leans towards a 13th century authorship, and the bulk of the traditional Orthodox world leans towards a 2nd century authorship. That's not at all to diminish the value of the Zohar. I can tell you, I asked my own Rebbe once, the late Rabbi Uziel Malevsky of blessed memory. I once asked him, what do you make of this whole Zohar controversy? Is it written in the 13th century or the 2nd century? Did Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai write it, or is it somehow invalid? And Rabbi Malevsky said to me, it doesn't matter if it was written in the 13th century, because it's all true. He said it's all powerful and relevant, and where it exactly comes from is not important. I'm not quoting him exactly. I also asked him, by the way, because there is a ban on studying Kabbalah before you're 40 years old. And I was maybe 25 years old, and I had this little book, beautiful book called Chok Yisrael, which is a great... It breaks the weekly parsha up into 7 days, and each day you study a little bit of Torah, a little bit of Tanakh, a little bit of Mishnah, a little bit of Talmud, a little bit of Musar, a little bit of Halacha, and at the end, a little bit of Zohar. And I said to Rabbi Malevsky, I'm not 40 years old, am I allowed to read this paragraph of Zohar? And he said, sure, Hillel, go ahead, you can read it. And I said, yeah, how come? He says, because you're not going to understand any of it. So, anyways, so the bottom line for our purposes today is that I can't give a lecture on Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai without mentioning the association with the Zohar, but I can't mention the association of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai with the Zohar without mentioning that it is a subject of huge controversy and could well be a creation of the 13th century and not the 2nd. God willing, when we move on in the series, we should do a lecture sometime on Moshe de Leon and try to understand more about him and the Zohar and the controversy, but that's not for today's discussion. The death of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai is widely celebrated today, particularly in the city of Meron. The mystical classics describe his death in very, very powerful terms, in which he was surrounded by all of his students, and he gives like kind of a last testimony. He says, "Now I am going to teach you my most secret holy teachings," and he goes up into a pillar of fire that lasts for a while the students are trying to absorb the Torah that's somehow emanating from the fire, and then at the end of it he's gone. His body's disappeared and so on. And so in commemoration of that death, traditionally on the date Lag BaOmer, although I understand there's some controversy about that particular date, Mr. Rodriguez tells me, but I haven't done the research yet, on that day, in the city of Meron, which is associated with his death, where his burial is, they have a bonfire. And that's why on Lag BaOmer, this particular holiday, it's celebrated through these fires. And it's a very Kabbalistic kind of ritual that's celebrated world around. There's another thing that they do on Lag BaOmer, which is associated very much with Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai and the Kabbalah, is that 3-year-old boys get their first haircuts, the so-called upsherin, because the book of Psalms says that a man is like a tree in the field, and just like the Torah says that trees should not have their fruit consumed during the first 3 years of their growth, so too the hair should grow long, but on the 3rd year, for lots of interesting Kabbalistic reasons, that's when on Lag BaOmer specifically, you have this haircut. It's more common with Hasidim than it is with Lithuanians, but I was kind of having fun, so I put a picture here of my son's first haircut, Alexander. Here you can see this is him. This is a typical Lithuanian haircut. It's a kind of a typical Lithuanian expression too. He's like a little bit stunned and not sure what to do. The guy in the back there with the dark beard, I'm not exactly sure who's that man holding my son. And then because I was kind of having fun putting this together, this is probably not going to go on the internet. Here's what my son, this is Alexander, this is what he looks like now. And that's in Israel. I think he's a pretty good looking guy. He looks a little bit like this guy, right? James Dean, right? Let's go back. There's Alexander. There's James Dean. I don't know. I think so, right? There's something. I got to watch out for it. Anyways, let us return finally to the last part of the story that we've been discussing, which, by the way, is in Tractate Shabbat, page 33b. So you recall what happened is they're in the cave for 12 years. You presume they're studying Kabbalah and they're, meditating and traveling the world through their spiritual journeys and things like that while remaining physically in the cave. They come out, whatever they see burns up because they're so holy, and they can't understand why people would engage in regular mundane activities when they have this tremendous learning that they could be doing instead. Then God says, I don't like this, get back in the cave. They spend another year in the cave, and then they come out. So what happens when they come out the second time? Rabbi Shimon says to his son, Beni, dai li'olam ani va'ata. It's enough for the world, just you and me. Meaning, we can't help it. People are still going to be involved in field plowing and all these kind of business things. But as long as you and I are studying Torah with this level of intensity, that's enough for the universe. Just the two of us studying with intensity. This is kind of like a movement in his literary persona from the intolerance of how could they possibly be doing that to saying, well, okay, it's unfortunate, they're going to do that, and we're going to do our thing. But listen to this third level. What happens is they're out there and they kind of had this attitude that, we're the elite, we're the intellectual leaders, and we're going to be engaged in our Torah, and what can you do in Nebuch? These are regular Jews, they're much lower than us. Finally, what happens is, they saw a certain old man who was carrying 2 bundles of myrtle. By the way, when it says Hahu Saba, a certain old man, there's a Talmudic tradition that says that's Eliyahu Hanavi, Elijah the prophet. Again, in disguise this time as a certain old man. They don't know it's Elijah the prophet, but they see an old man carrying 2 bundles of myrtle. V'rahit ben ashmashos, and he's running because it's Friday afternoon. It's going to be Shabbos soon. So Amru lei, they said to him, Hanei lamalach, what are you carrying those for? Amar lahu lechavod Shabbos. I'm carrying these in honor of the Sabbath. So they say to him, V'taski lecha b'chad. So what are you carrying two for? You only need one. And he says to them, Chad keneged zachor v'chad keneged shamor. No, it says in the Torah, there's two passages in which the Ten Commandments occur. In one passage it says, remember the Sabbath day. In the other passage it says, guard the Sabbath day. So therefore I have two bunches of myrtle. One is in memory of that passage, remember. One is in memory of that passage, guard. Just like we typically have 2 loaves of bread for the hamotzi, things like that. There are other reasons too. So then Rabbi Shimon says, Amar le lebrei. He says to his